Welcome everyone to the last session of the Ignite. All of you have shown courage to stay all the way till the last session. So there's a surprise gift. Everybody gets a Surface Pro 3. No, I'm just joking. So I'm Vishal Mehrotra. I'm the Group Program Manager of Azure Site Recovery. And I have with me Philip Moss, the Managing Partner for NTTX. Okay, so since many of you have flights pretty soon after this, we'll try to move as fast as possible. And folks who have time, we can have some questions after the session also. So these are the key objectives we have for today's sessions. We want to talk about how service providers or SIs can leverage DRaaS opportunity to make money. We'll talk about what are the growth opportunities in that area, how you can make money using Azure Site Recovery. We'll talk about how you can what are the best practices when you're deploying Azure Site Recovery? We had multiple sessions during this week where Manoj from our team talked about Hyper-V to Azure DR, Gaurav talked about VMware to Azure, on-prem to on-prem, and so on. So we'll take it from there and go slightly behind the scene and some best practices, what needs to be done there. And last but not the least, Philip comes on stage and talks about how he's leveraging ASR and what are his experiences with ASR. Okay. So before we talk about what is ASR and how service provider can leverage it, let's spend just 2 minutes on why business continuity or disaster recovery is important. In fact, that's one of the challenges a service provider faces when you're interacting with your customer. So when we started ASR, we spent a lot of time researching this area. And some of the findings were really eye-opening. For example, there's a research report which talks about that organization typically experience 4+ disruptions in a year. Now, normally when we think about disaster recovery, we think about things like earthquake, fire, flood, and so on. And fortunately, nature is kind enough that we don't get those kind of disruptions 4 times in a year. And that was like puzzling for me, that why then there are 4 disasters or disruptions in a year. And when you double click in this report, you'll find out the top reasons for disruptions are not those fire, earthquake, and things like that. The top reasons for disruptions are manual error, software error, hardware error. Those are the reasons why your organization experiences 4+ disruptions in a year and needs some protection from them. And why do they need protection from those disruptions? Because there's a lot of reports which talks about depending on what business you are, which segment you are in, there's a loss on the revenue you have. Like one of the segments, you can have revenue loss up to $1.5 million per hour. And if that is not enough, there are reports which talks about almost 4 out of the 10 businesses do not even reopen after the disasters because they are very ill prepared to handle those disruptions. Now let me call out very clearly, when we use the term disaster recovery, we differentiate it from backup. Almost every customer I go and talk about, do you have a disaster recovery plan? Everybody says, yes, we have a disaster recovery plan. A good portion of those customers talk about their DR plan as, yeah, we have these data on a tape, we send it to Iron Mountain on offsite, we have subscribed to this cloud backup service, we send data there, so if we have a disaster, all our data is safe. All your data is safe, absolutely right. However, if you are using any of these methods as your disaster recovery plan, it will take you days, if not weeks, to get your applications up and running. Let me repeat it. It will take you days, if not weeks, to get your application up and running. And think about how much millions of revenue loss you will have. And more importantly, the good chances is that your business does not even reopen after you come back from that disaster. Last but not the least, there are a lot of compliances like ISO, HIPAA, FISMA, and so on, which requires you to have a DR plan. So that's also a key reason. If you want your application to be certified by those standards, you need to have a disaster recovery plan in place. There is a very nice report from IDC which talks about, for your industry, you can check what is the typical average amount of downtime it's expected in that industry, what's the productivity loss, and you get an idea that how much money you will lose if you don't have a first-class disaster recovery plan in place. Now that is great. With that data, your customers are convinced that they need to invest in disaster recovery. but why as a service provider or why as a SI partner I should care about DR? What's in it for me? So we have researched a report from Gartner which talks about if you're offering DR as a service to your customer, you can make somewhere from around $100 per instance per month to around $700 per instance per month. And for your example, I have put an example where we being a modest service provider, we are just charging $200 per VM per month. And we are using Azure as a target. So if you use Azure as a target with Azure Site Recovery, and in first year you just offer DR as a service to 1,000 VMs, you can make around $1.6 million. So it's a huge, huge opportunity to make money. And let me repeat, Gartner, as per Gartner, the range is $100 to $700. And in this example, we are using just $200 as a price point which you can charge to your customers. Okay, so Azure Site Recovery is a service which provides you DR for all your platforms, be it Hyper-V, VMware Physical, across all your clouds and for all your workloads. So the first scenario which we released early part of last year is a typical DR scenario, whereas an enterprise or a service provider have two data centers called as primary site and a secondary site, and you use Azure Site Recovery to perform disaster recovery management between the two sites. Some of the key points of this architecture is that the data and applications are running in your data center and they replicate between the two sites on your own replication channel. None of the data goes to the Microsoft Azure Site Recovery ever. We have no knowledge about your application. We have no knowledge about your data. In fact, the host or VMs which are running your application need not have any internet connectivity. They can be within your cage. The only component which requires internet connectivity is System Center Virtual Machine Manager, which is managing your infrastructure. And there also it's an outbound HTTPS connectivity. So there is no need to open up any firewall or any inbound port and so on and so forth. So our customers love this capability. And next scenario which we released is this DR to Azure, because one of the most complex, most challenging part of a DR project is cost and complexity associated with the DR. Now, what if you don't need to set up a secondary site? So we released this scenario where using Azure, you can perform DR from your on-prem data center to Azure. So no need to set up a complex data center, no need to manage the complex data center. Azure is providing all that capability. So our customer loves both these scenarios, DR between two private cloud, DR to public cloud, service provider cloud. And the feedback we got from our customer is that most of my customers are heterogeneous, because first we released both these scenarios for Hyper-V platforms. And we totally acknowledge that. So at that point, we acquired a company called InMarch. Anybody heard of InMarch here? Oh, many of you. So great. So we acquired a company called InMarch, and now we have integrated that technology with Azure Site Recovery. So with the same Azure Site Recovery service, with same experience, now you can do DR between two of your VMware physical sites or from VMware to Azure also. So now ASR provides you one single service which works across platform, across cloud, and across your workloads. In fact, recently Gartner released a Magic Quadrant for DRaaS. And any guesses which was the number one in the rightmost quadrant? Sorry? No, neither Amazon nor Microsoft. The number one in the quadrant was SunGuard. SunGuard has been put up as the number one DR service provider. And InMarch technology, which we acquired and is now part of ASR, is used by SunGuard to offer DR as a service. Now the next question is then why we are not there in that quadrant. The reason we are not there in that quadrant this year, because Gartner has a certain criteria that you should be minimum these many years in the market before you are included in that quadrant. So next year Azure Site Recovery will be part of Gartner. However, in some sense we are represented there because SunGuard is in the top quadrant, and InMarch technology, which we acquired and is now part of ASR, is used by SunGuard. Okay, so enough of talk. Let's have a quick demo of how you can leverage this technology to perform a single-click failover of your application so you can quickly get recovered from those disruptions you experience in a year. Okay. So how many of you are aware of Azure Site Recovery or played with Azure Site Recovery? Okay, some of you. Azure Site Recovery is available as a service in Azure portal. So this is the Azure portal, and I as an admin of this infrastructure has received an alert that in next 24 hours, Sandy is going to hit our data center. And what we can do is perform a preventive avoidance of disaster recovery. To enable that, what you need to do is just select your application's recovery plan and perform a gesture, what is called plant failover. So it tells me that currently I'm running it on an on-premise site SharePoint, and I'm going to Azure and press the button. It's as simple as that. So if as an admin you get information that your data center may have a disruption, you can proactively fail over your application from on-premise site to a site in Azure or to your service provider site or any other target site. Now, this is very powerful because with plant failover, we give you a capability that you will have zero data loss. Even in this disaster situation, you will not have even a single second of data loss. And how do we enable this? So let me go into the jobs view, and you can see the plant failover has started. And if you go inside the plant failover, you'll see Azure Site Recovery has all the automation to perform this failover from your site. So the SharePoint is created on the recovery site without any manual steps from you with zero data loss. So how do we achieve the zero data loss in this condition? What we do, first we recognize your application and we go to the primary site and shut down your different tiers of your applications. We understand what is the dependency in your application. So for example, in our recovery plan, we provide you these capabilities called group. A group is nothing but to model the dependencies in your application. So in my SharePoint site, I have app tier, which should come first, then the web tier, which should come second. However, when I want to fail over the application to a recovery site, I shut down them in the reverse order of the group. So you can see shutdown, I do shutdown of group 2 first. So Azure Site Recovery will first shut down your app tiers, then it will shut down your web tiers, then it will shut down your app tier, then the SQL tier, and then send whatever changes you made on-prem and not be sent to the recovery site. So all those changes will be sent, and then all those VMs will be started. Not just that, recovery plan is all about automating all your disaster recovery plans. Basically, when we started this product, we spent a lot of time reviewing customers' actual disaster recovery plan, those 30 pages booklets they have for their DR plans. Our vision with Azure Site Recovery is you don't need to keep those 30 pages booklet. You can just model everything here. So you can model scripts, you can model manual action, and just press this button, and the whole application fails over from site A to site B. So this demo will take time, so we'll come back to this demo. Okay, now, one of the top questions we hear from the service provider is Microsoft's story for service provider is Microsoft Azure Pack, which gives you an identical experience like Azure for the service provider to offer to their customers. What is the Azure Site Recovery integration with WAP? The good news is that Azure Site Recovery is fully integrated with Windows Azure Pack. So what you can see here, we have 2 data centers. The first data center is managed by Windows Azure Pack. The second data center is also managed by Windows Azure Pack. Azure Site Recovery is doing DR between the 2 data centers. Not just that, in the booth space, you might have seen Microsoft's cloud platform system or converged infrastructure solution. Azure Site Recovery is also the DR if you buy 2 CPS stack and you want to do DR between 2 of them. Azure Site Recovery is the DR method to do DR between both of them. Now let's have a quick demo of how you can do Azure Site Recovery, enable disaster recovery as a service for your WAP customers. So we'll get to the demo, and our plant failover is going on. Let's go to the Windows Azure Pack demo. So how many of you have seen Windows Azure Pack? Okay, almost half of you. So this is your familiar Windows Azure Pack tenant portal experience. I have two sites. This is my hoster primary site and the tenant portal on the primary site. This is the secondary site and the tenant portal on the secondary site. Now, Azure Site Recovery has a first-class integration with Windows Azure Pack. Windows Azure Pack has this concept called plans. Using Azure Site Recovery, you can offer DR as a service add-on to those plans. So, for example, in this case, I am the admin of Contoso, and I have an application, two-tier application running on-premise on my site, the app tier and the DB tier. Now, I have subscribed to my service provider's DR plan. So, if I go to the secondary site and see the tenant portal of the secondary site, what I will get is the two VMs, same app server and DB server VM, but they are in the stopped state. On the primary side, I log into the same tenant portal and I see the two VMs, but they are in the running state. So as a tenant, you don't need to learn anything new. You just subscribe to the service provider's DRaaS plan. Azure Site Recovery automatically enable protection of your VMs from site A to site B, and tenant can just log into the secondary site's web portal and can see the replica VM which will be in the stopped state. However, as a service provider, you will be offering your customer some sort of a DR drill, like once every quarter, once every 6 months. So suppose today is the first Monday of the quarter where you have an SLA that you will give DR drill to your customers. So as a service provider, you will go to Azure Site Recovery and want to perform DR drill for your customer. So performing DR drill for your customer is also very simple. You go back to the same recovery plans, select a recovery plan, but this time we will not do plan failover. What we will do is called test failover, and we will select a network for my customer. So this is a Contoso customer, but we are doing DR drill, so we have a test network created for the Contoso customer, and we perform the job. So performing a DR drill is again as simple as selecting a recovery plan and one click. Like anything else in Azure Site Recovery, you can go to the jobs view and see how the test failover is going on. So let's log in and see what's happening in the test failover. Now, as part of this best practices session, if there is just one thing I would like you to take away, this will be that thing. The most important thing for having a successful DR implementation is doing a periodic test failover. Now, seems very obvious, seems very common understanding. However, majority of the time when we talk to the customers are not able to do that on a periodic basis. Now, talk to any customer of yours and ask them, do they have a DR plan? Majority of them will say, yes, we have a DR plan. Ask them, can you press a button and show me that how your DR plans will work? And majority of the customers, no, I can't press that button. There's something bad will happen to my production. And the reason for that reaction is because they're using some old technologies which do not provide the capability what ASR provides. ASR provides you a test failover capability in an isolated network, so there is no impact at all on your production. So the litmus test for me is that if a customer says they have a DR plan, I would like them to press the button and show me, like we are showing in this demo, that we can press a button and get the SharePoint form. We can press a button and fail over this two-tier application without impacting production. And majority of your customers you'll find will not be able to do that. Okay, so the test failover is going on. Now, the power of test failover is, since it creates a copy of your environment in a production site in an isolated network, it is not just used for the DR drill, which you can do it with confidence. You can also use the same technology for a very common scenario, especially in the cloud, whether it's service provider cloud or public cloud, called dev test. Now today, dev test is a very successful scenario, whether it's AWS cloud, Azure cloud, or service provider cloud. However, majority of the customer, the way they use dev test, they have a set of templates either in the AWS library or Azure library. They create some automation script, create those environments. after they do the testing, apply the patch and so on. However, when they apply the same patch in production, they still find issues. Why? Any idea? Why they still find issues? They are done the testing in the test. This happens very often. And the reason they find the issues is because your production environment is not static as the images in those AWS or Azure libraries. Those are standard Windows Server 2012 image, SQL Server image, and so on. Your production environment is constantly churning. It is getting the latest patches. Last week, you had an issue. Some developer logged into the environment, changed a registry key or changed a config file to improve the performance. None of those changes are being replicated to the templates you have in the service provider cloud or public cloud. Now with Azure Site Recovery, since we use this replication-based engine, all these changes are replicated all the time. So with this one single click failover, test failover button, we are giving you a capability which is really strong. Our dev test loves that capability. On any multi-machine LOB app which you have, enable ASR, perform test failover. What you have just given to your dev test team is an environment which is identical to production. They can perform whatever testing they want to perform, and once they are done, press another button, clean up, and the environment is deleted for you. So as a service provider, not just DR, you can also offer dev test as a service and make money on those scenarios. Okay, so it seems the test failover is going on, and the DB server VM is started, app server VM is being started. Now this is great. A service provider can see this and say, hey, I am doing the DR drill, your VMs are coming up, all good. But how, as a tenant, I can get the confidence that the DR drill is working well? So that is also very easy with ASR integration with Windows Azure Pack. So the tenant can go to the secondary data center. So let's go to the secondary data center and see the magic. Now you can see the test failover has created two VMs, one app server underscore test, second DB server underscore test. These are the two VMs created automatically by ASR in an isolated network. So the tenant can log into this network, validate his application, and be confident that my DR drill works. So if I will hit any of those 4+ disruptions a customer hit in a year, I can use ASR and perform the failover. And the most important point, this is without impacting production. So if I go back to my primary site, you can see my application is still running on the primary site. So this is ASR provides you without impacting production test failover, which you can use for different scenarios. Okay, so we talked about dev test, ASR solution. Last but not the least, it's basically dev test on demand. So you don't need to pay all the time for the test environment. If you want to leverage a public cloud or service provider cloud, whenever you want to do testing, maybe once every month, press the test failover button, the environment is created for you. And once you are done for your testing, you can press a button called cleanup test environment. Azure Site Recovery will delete all the copy of that environment and so on. So you pay only for the time being while your environment is used. Okay. So this is how we enable Azure Site Recovery integration with Azure Pack. What we provide you a set of SMA runbooks. So if you there is a detailed blog post and documentation available, but we have a set of runbooks which you need to download to your Windows Azure Pack. And the job of this runbook is to ensure that any plan which is enabled for DR, anytime a tenant creates a VM in that plan, all the VMs will be automatically enabled for protection by ASR. Similarly, a plan where there is no DR enabled, ASR will not do anything with that plan. With UR4, in your plan, you can get a UI view where you can say, now I want to enable protection using Azure Site Recovery for this plan. Now this is great. People who have Windows Azure Pack love this demo, they like it. But we also have a set of service providers or partners who have built their own consoles. And they want Azure Site Recovery to be integrated into their own consoles. So the good news is that that is also possible. As a principle, anything which you can do in Azure Site Recovery user interface, we provide that in our APIs. It may be delayed by a couple of months after the capability is released, but everything which you can do in ASR UI, you can do from API. Now again, APIs have religions. There are people who like PowerShell, there are people who like REST, there are people who want to do C# SDK. We don't believe in any one of those religions. We support ASR APIs as part of Azure SDK, so you get your choice of API. You love PowerShell, use PowerShell. You love REST API, use REST API, and so on and so forth. So let's have a quick demo of how easy it is to use ASR APIs. So we go back to this vault, and we go back to some of the clouds, the VMM clouds we have, and there is a cloud called Silver Cloud. In the Silver Cloud, there is this VM SDK demo which is already protected, and if I want to protect another machine, it's so as simple as selecting the VM and press OK button. But I don't want this VM to be protected from UI. I want this VM to be protected from the API capabilities. So I can go back to my primary data center, and in this example, I am using PowerShell as interface. Okay. This is horribly slow. Okay, so as you can see here, there is a script we have provided called enabledr.ps. This script is available as part of the blog post we released for ASR APIs. And enabling VM for DR is as simple as telling the name of the container, which is the cloud in which your VM, in this case it's Silver Cloud, then providing the list of the VMs for which you want to enable protection. In this case, it's only one VM SDK demo. And what is the protection state? We want to enable the protection. Okay, same command you can use and pass disable as a parameter, and it will work for that also. So let's see. Not just that, you can also perform failovers using this capability. So we have another console where let's try to perform a failover. So this is the command for failover, where you can provide the recovery plan name. We have a recovery plan called SDK demo RP. You have to provide what is the failover type. So we provide multiple types of failovers. In SharePoint, since it was a proactive DR case, we did a planned failover. In the DR drill scenario, we did a test failover. So all those failovers, we also provide unplanned failover is available. And you also need to provide what is the direction of your failover. Are you going from primary side to the recovery side? Are you going from recovery side to the primary side? Please excuse me for the slowness. We could not get the wired connection working, so we are on wireless, RDPing into a machine far away from here. Okay, so you can say primary. Okay, and you also have to specify whether you want reverse replication or you want commit or not. Okay, seems some bug. Let me see if this is fast. It's too slow. Okay, this is too slow. So while it's coming back, let me see if the enable DR job is started on the portal. So we go to the portal, and you can see, like for SDK demo, enable DR protection job is started, and you can go inside the job and start doing the seeing the progress. Now on the recovery plan, you just saw the two commands called reverse replicate and and commit. Now there is a lot of time we get this question from customer that why do we need to provide commit? Why can't you automate this? So commit is also a very important best practice for DR implementation. The semantic of commit is very much similar to the semantic of commit in your database transactions. You perform your transaction, you see if the states are as you expected at the end of the transaction. If yes, you do commit. If no, you do fail back. With Azure Site Recovery, we provide you a very similar semantic. Once you perform the failover of your application from site A to site B, after that, we recommend you to log into your application, validate application is working great. If yes, then you perform the commit gesture. However, if that is not the case, at that point you have the capability to select an earlier point in time and recover your application to that point in time. It's a really important capability, because if you press commit without validating the application, after commit we delete all your recovery points in the prior state. So it's a very, very important best practice that when you fail over, first validate your application and then only perform the commit button. Now then, what is reverse replication? Reverse replication is used for scenarios like you have a power maintenance of 4 hours on your primary data center and you don't want your application to be down. With Azure Site Recovery, we provide you a very simple way to fail over your application to the recovery site. So you do plant failover, app is running on the recovery site. Now after 4 hours, your primary data center comes back again. But your application is running now on the secondary site. How do you take your application back from the secondary site to the primary site? Now to do that, first you need to transfer all the changes which has happened in the last 4 hours from the secondary site to the primary site. How do you do that? By performing this gesture called reverse replication. So when you tell ASR reverse replication, it's a signal to say that I want to go back to the primary site, but before I go back, send all the changes which the application has done while it was running on the recovery site. So we'll start sending all those changes back to the primary site, and once all the changes are done, coming back to the primary site is again just one click. Press the same plant failover button again, the direction will be changed. Now Azure back to on-premise. It's as simple as that. Unlike many of the competitors where failover is easy, but coming back is a huge, huge complex task. With Azure Site Recovery, we provide you a single click failback also. First do reverse replication and then perform failback. You have a question? Thank you. Okay. So moving on. So how a service provider or SI work with ASR and with customer? Like there are like a lot of questions we get, like what's the business model? Will my customer gets the ASR bill or will we get the ASR bill and things like that? So the model is very simple. Jeremy, who is the hoster service provider, he will be the administrator of Azure account and the ASR, and he will pay the whatever is the ASR license fee. However, Jeremy will charge his customer whatever they want to charge for the DRaaS. Like we saw from Gartner, $100 to $700. So you decide for your customer how much money you want to make by offering DR. We have no knowledge about your customer. The relationship will happen between ASR and the service provider. Some of the common questions we get, that service provider support both shared infrastructure as well as multi-tenanted. ASR works with both of them. Some of the service provider feels Azure is a competitor for them, so they don't want to share their tenant's identity with Azure. You don't need to do that. With Azure, we have only your identity. So service provider admin has an account in Azure. None of your tenant need to have any account in Azure. Will your tenant get any bill? No, they will not. Will tenant's data will go into the public cloud? If you're doing DR between two of your data center or customer data center to your data center, the data will never go to the public cloud. If you're doing DR into Azure, the data will go into Azure. This is interesting, that will my VMs be running on the target site, be it Azure, be it the service provider site when we are doing replication? No, your VMs will not be running. And this is really critical. We have designed Azure Site Recovery as a first-class public cloud DR technology. Unlike some of our competitors who have used the existing technology and started putting on the public cloud, where you have to run all the VMs in the cloud. So think about it. You have 100 VMs and you want to do DR for those 100 VMs. You have to pay Azure IaaS compute charges for all those 100 VMs. Typical Azure VM will come for $300. Now multiply 100 with $300. That is your sink cost just running those VMs in the cloud. Not just that. Now since you're running 2 VMs, you have to pay licenses twice. So if you are running a SQL Server on-prem, 1 license, SQL Server in cloud, 2nd license. Exchange on-prem, 1 license, Exchange there, 2nd license. So it's a huge expensive. With Azure Site Recovery, at a steady state, when you have just got protection with ASR, nothing is running in the cloud. So you don't need to pay Azure IaaS charges for your production application. Neither you have to pay the licensing twice. That is a huge, huge advantage to offer DR with Azure Site Recovery. Do we support? Yes, please. So the question is, what about storage? Yes, when you're replicating, the data is stored in the storage, you will need to pay for the storage. But the cost of storage is 2 cents per GB as opposed to $300 of ISVM cost. That is correct. That is correct. Okay, so the last, a lot of time we get this question that, will the tenants be isolated when we are doing DR into Azure? Of course, yes. And how we enable that isolation is simple. This is on, the orange is your service provider data center. Right side, we have Microsoft Azure. As a service provider, you create a subscription in Microsoft Azure where you put all the Azure Site Recovery, Vault, Recovery Plan, and so on. When the first customer comes in, you deploy their infrastructure on-premise. You create an Azure subscription also for them, and the data starts replicating from the customer infrastructure in your service provider data center into Azure. The second customer comes up, you follow the same sequence. Now, in the case you want to fail over the customer infrastructure, what happens is these VMs are brought up in your Azure infrastructure, and each of these tenants are the owner only for their own subscription. So when they log in, they will be able to see only the VMs, the storage account and network for their infrastructure. They will not be able to see either the other customer's VM storage network, nor they will be able to see the ASR, because all the ASR artifacts like recovery plan are part of the subscription which you own as a service provider. Now this is great, like people love this and say, wow, great technology, platform is great, you have Hyper-V, VMware Physical, but we need DR for workloads. We need DR for SharePoint, we need DR for Exchange, SAP, Oracle. What is ASR story with for all these workloads? So we are happy to announce in this decade that we have worked with all these workloads team, and SharePoint team has certified ASR as its DR solution. Not just SharePoint team, we have worked with Exchange team, and Exchange team has certified ASR as its DR solution. Now Exchange also has Exchange DAG, which is the replication for Exchange mailboxes. So wherever you have Exchange with Exchange DAG, we leverage Exchange DAG. However, when you have implementation where Exchange DAG is not available, for those implementation, you can use any of the other ASR replication also. Not just that, we have worked with SQL. SQL has certified ASR as a DR solution for its application. So all of you must be knowing about SQL Availability Group. It's a great replication technology for SQL. However, when SQL team talks to its customer, their customer says that I love SQL Availability Group, but I don't want DR just for SQL. I want DR for my payroll app. I want DR for my HR app. And that includes SQL, that includes web tier, middle tier, and so much. So what is your solution? And that's where SQL team and ASR team work together and certified ASR to be the DR solution for any app leveraging SQL. Now again, SQL, if the SQL Availability Group is available, we will use that as a replication channel. ASR will use that. In fact, in the SharePoint demo, that is what I am using. If SQL Availability Group is not available, you can use any other replication channel provided by ASR. Another announcement, Dynamics has certified ASR for DR. In fact, Dynamics did a demo in one of the sessions we have early part of the year. So I can keep on like that, but I don't want to bore you with all these single slides. So we have a single slide which talks about all the workloads which has certified ASR as a DR solution. The way to interpret this slide is the dark green is the one where workload team has already certified ASR as its DR solution. And all workloads are there, AD, DNS, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, whatever you like. The light green line talks about the workloads which we have tested and make sure that it works, but we haven't got yet the certification from the workload team, and we are working on them. Okay, now the world has thousands of workloads. We can't be in this business of certification with each of these LOB apps, something which is used by 10 people, something 100 people, and so on. So what we are trying to do is try to model a certain patterns and certify those patterns. And the most common pattern where most of the LOB apps fits in is the typical 3-tier application. So this is your typical 3-tier application. Here we have SQL backend, front-end, app tier, and things like that. And in this model, what you're doing, you're using ASR as a replication channel to replicate all the front ends, and ASR provides you that one single click recovery plan failover, which we saw earlier. Another very common pattern we have seen with many of our enterprise customers, that they have clustering on the SQL server and they love SQL availability group, that it does a great job of replicating data to the secondary side. Now here, ASR also provides you a single click failover of your complete application, as we saw with SharePoint, where some of the tiers will be replicated by ASR replication channel and some tiers are replicated with SQL's replication channel. In fact, you can have multiple replication channels supported by ASR. Now let's go back to our first demo, which we kicked off at the early part of the demo, and see what goes behind the scene. It's very easy to click a button and get the whole application up and running. But there's a lot of technology and a lot of orchestration is happening behind the scene to give you that seamless experience. So this is the SharePoint site, which we failed over at the start of the demo. It has SQL availability group implemented as a HA. It has a middle tier, and it has web tier implemented as a scale-out web tier. Then it has a load balancer. SharePoint on most of the Microsoft workloads uses AD, so there is a AD DNS. And the way a customer of this SharePoint site, which could be anywhere in the world, will use this service is, it will talk to the public DNS. Public DNS will give the IP address of the NAT of the service. The customer will connect to that NAT and be able to use the SharePoint app. Fairly straightforward way for a customer to leverage your app. Now, if you want to do DR for this app, the scope expands, where we bring Azure Site Recovery as your DR management software. And in this example, we are using Azure as a target site. So you use Azure as a target site. And what we do is we set up a site-to-site VPN. Site-to-site VPN is required because we want to replicate AD to the secondary site. Now, AD replication requires site-to-site VPN, so we set up site-to-site VPN. ASR works both with site-to-site VPN or without site-to-site. So site-to-site VPN is not a mandatory requirement for ASR, but if you want to use AD replication, it is required. And as we said, ASR works with multiple replication channel. We enable that. We set up SQL always on, which is the replication channel to replicate your SQL, and we have got a SQL VM running, which is getting the data from the SQL. And we use ASR replication channel to replicate the web tier and middle tier to the secondary site. Now, we talked about failing over the application from site A to site B, and we have seen that press a button and we get everything replicated. That's great. ASR has orchestrated all the logic. However, when you have customers all over the world and they were using your application running in your data center or customer data center, suddenly we move the whole application to Azure. Will you need to send a mail to all the customer that now use a different URL, different IP address, and to access it? That doesn't work in the real world. So what we use is another Azure service called Azure Traffic Manager. How many of you have used Azure Traffic Manager? Okay, very few. So ASR has a great integration with Azure Traffic Manager where there is zero impact for your customers. Your customers will not even know that the application which they were using on-prem has been moved from on-premise site to a recovery site, and everything will work seamless for them. So the way it works is, before failover, what we'll do, your customer will talk to the DNS server, And instead of DNS server pointing to the application URL, it has got an indirection inbuilt. It will point it to Azure Traffic Manager. Azure Traffic Manager will give the URL of the SharePoint site, which is on-prem, and now your customer is able to access the site. However, if you have a disaster or a failover, what will happen? Azure Site Recovery will perform the SQL availability group failover. So now as you can see that the SQL on the right side has become the primary SQL, and Azure Site Recovery will bring all the VMs on the secondary site automatically for you in the order as you defined in the recovery plan. And Azure Site Recovery has a rich integration with Azure Automation, another service in Azure, where we have published a set of scripts. One of the common script is, if you have a farm out architecture where you have 2 web tiers, when the app goes into Azure, it should also be put in a load balance infrastructure. All that is done for you. We have provided the script, so the load balancer will also be automatically created for you. And a recovery service endpoint is created. Now when your customer anywhere in the world connects to this application, the query goes to the public DNS, which goes to Azure Traffic Manager, and Azure Traffic Manager recognizes that the application is not running on-prem and returns the endpoint of the cloud service on the Azure site. So this is how your client will continue to access the service as if there is no change has happened behind the scene. Now with this, you will be able to recognize that the people who are using cloud backup or the tape to do DR, and in the case of failover they want to bring this up, it will take them days or weeks, and most likely they'll be out of business by the time they come back. So no point spending even days and weeks. Use that time to find a new job. Okay. So this is how a client can access the application on the recovery side. Setting up Traffic Manager is fairly straightforward in Azure. You can make the standard, like we talked about, is a redirection. So whatever is your application URL, like contoso.com, instead of giving the IP address of that, you give Traffic Manager redirection. In the Traffic Manager, give both the URLs, your on-prem URL and the recovery URL. And by default, Traffic Manager will have this status. Your on-prem will be online and your public cloud URL will be degraded. But when you fail over the application, it will reverse so that the client, when it accesses the Traffic Manager, they get the public URL. Okay. So let's quickly talk about, so we have spent a lot of time deploying this technology with customer, partners, and so on, and we have got some learnings from that, and just want to share some of those. So typically an ASR deployment consists of 3 phases: the planning phase, infrastructure phase, and deployment phase. However, we have found majority of the issue you will hit when you're implementing a DR project is not about the software or the technology, it's about poor planning or poor infrastructure provisioning. So we have built a lot of tools or prescriptive methods which will help you to plan it well and provision it well so you can have a seamless DR deployment. So for example, when we talk about planning, any DR project is basically a trade-off between cost and RTO RPO. Take any DR project. And the good news is that with ASR, we provide you the full spectrum. As a DR consultant for your customer, you can decide what you want. So for example, if your customer wants, say, 5 minutes of RPO, RTO of 1 hour, you can use ASR-based replication for all the tiers, perform that one-click failover, and everything should come up roughly around 1 hour. However, your customer is a big enterprise customer, they can't afford 1 hour of downtime. They want the app to come up in less than 30 minutes. Now what you can do? In those cases, you can observe where the time is going when I'm doing failover. For example, AD is a critical component of your infrastructure. What if you can run the AD in the recovery sites using AD replication? In the case of failover, you don't need to wait for AD to come up. It's already there. Similarly, SQL is another critical component of your infrastructure. If you can run the SQL all the time, using SQL always on, you can save the time during the failover. So the failover can be very fast. However, since you're running SQL on the other side, since you're running AD on the other side, the cost will increase. So depending on your customer requirement, You can go with the first option or the second option. But irrespective of which option you go for, it's far ahead of your backup where the option is to go out of business. Now, the customer can be a big bank. For bank, even 5 minutes of RPO is not enough. They want zero data loss. Good news is that with ASR SAN-based replication, we provide you zero data loss. ASR works with all the big SAN vendors in the world. We have already released support for HP, NetApp, EMC, and we are working with any named vendor in storage space, whether it's IBM, Dell, Hitachi, and so on and so forth. Last but not the least, there is no no silver bullet to say that this customer needs this only. What you can do is use test failover capability, try the failover, measure the time, and find out where the time is going in the application to come up. If a lot of time is going in SQL, maybe the SQL AG can save you. If a lot of time is going in AD, maybe the AD replication can save you. If a lot of time is going in doing some manual steps, maybe automating that manual steps can save you time, and so on. Okay, we are great to announce another announcement. We have worked with our partner NetApp, and NetApp has a storage called NPS, where NetApp has put up the SAN storage arrays in all the Equinix data centers with the express route connection with Azure. So using the same ASR technology and NetApp NPS storage, what you can do DR, dev test, migration, cloud bursting, all the NPS scenarios, and leverage Azure compute, which is great compute, and leverage NetApp storage, which is great storage. So together, Azure, Express Route, ASR, and NetApp has come together, and there was a session in the morning by Hector where I have a link to the session where we have demoed that if you want to migrate or do DR of your workloads to Azure and you want to use SAN storage, you can do that now with our integration solution with NetApp NPS. Okay, so let's move on to the second stage of planning. Any DR project, the most important aspect of planning is what about storage, compute, and networking. And we have seen customers have different preferences. There is a set of customers who like to plan with Excel modeling. There is a set of customers who like to plan at a very deep level. So we provide you the support for both of them. So for example, if you're a customer who likes planning with Excel, doing some number crunching, shucks, I press 7. But the 7 is not working, it seems. 5 and 7, excuse me. Oh, I think that went into the lock mode. You can have disruptions anytime in the day. Thank you. Okay, so if you like modeling with Excel, we have provided a simple capacity planning Excel sheet where you can select what is your recovery site. Is it Azure? Is it another customer data center or your data center? So in this example, we are selecting Azure. How many VMs you want to replicate in one batch, and that's a very important metric as part of your planning. I'll share a recent examples where one of the customer who is deploying ASR at almost 1,000 VMs, and they started doing hundreds of VMs DR at the one time. There is nothing in ASR technology where you can't do that. You can do hundreds of thousands. It's a PaaS service running in Azure, so we have infinite scale. However, the bottleneck will not be the technology. The bottleneck will be the compute, storage, or most importantly, the network which exists between the primary site and the secondary site. So for example, in this case, I take 5 VMs I want to do in one time, because what they did when they did 100 VMs, they started choking the network by sending so much data, because first time when you enable DR for the VMs, all the VM data need to go from site A to site B. So you provide those values like how long you want the DR initial seeding need to happen, say 24 hours, what is the average size of the operations, and you tell and you provide the workload information for your different VMs. What is the CPU, RAM, churn rate, and so on. And once you do all this, you can come here and say refresh all, and it will give you a model that how much storage you will need on the recovery side for your workload, how much network you will need. And the key point I want to highlight is that the network which you need for the Delta replication will be always small, because this is just the churn, only the changes which are happening. But the network which will you need for the initial replication will be much higher. The need will be much higher, because you need to send all the data for all the VMs for the first time. Now, those are the places where you can play with these numbers. So for example, right now it says I need around 90 Mbps. Because the batch size of the VMs, we are protecting 5 VMs at a time. If I was the customer who did 100 VMs at a time, let's imagine what will happen to this number. Come here and do refresh all. Suddenly 90 Mbps becomes 1800 Mbps. So these are the places where you have to plan for your DR implementation. That how much network bandwidth is available for you, what should be the batch sizes by which you can control the network bandwidth. And it is not just the batch size. Like another thing which happened with our customer was that they enabled DR, and for like next 48 hours they were not seeing everything green. And they're saying, hey, it seems something not working well with ASR. 48 hours have happened, nothing happened. So no, it's working. It's sending the data, initial replication. You can go to the jobs view and see what's happening. So the next important parameter is what is the duration in which you want the initial replication to happen. Today we have put it 24 hours. So let's take it back to, and our network bandwidth need is around 1800. If I don't have that much bandwidth, and I'm fine that once I enable DR, it will take 4 days for the seed, then my network bandwidth should significantly reduce. So let's come back here and say refresh all. My network bandwidth has gone down. So those are the parameters you need to play with to plan for your DR project. Okay. Now while we are here, let's quickly see how our recovery plan is going. So it seems our recovery plan for SharePoint is completed. So you can see what ASR has done, everything for you behind the scene. You just press the button. It shut down all the VMs on the primary side. It ran a script to fail over the SQL AG, started the app tiers, started the web tiers, and it done the scripts on the recovery side, the load balancer and everything we talked about. So everything is done. And let's see what's the magic is done with ASR Azure Traffic Manager integration. So before the start of the demo, I ran this command, and you can see this is my SharePoint URL, which points to the Traffic Manager URL. And the way, so instead of giving the ASR on-prem, let me open the SharePoint site. So instead of the SharePoint site giving its own URL, it was giving the Traffic Manager URL, and Traffic Manager was giving the URL of the SharePoint site. Now we have failed over the full site in Azure, and let's see whether the SharePoint site comes up in Azure. So how do we validate it? We go to that SharePoint site, and while it is coming up, now this could be a SharePoint site running on-premise also. So how do we validate it's the site running in Azure? We run the same command again, and we can see that the site URL always points to the Traffic Manager, but unlike in the past before the failover, now Traffic Manager points to a new URL, which is the public cloud URL of SharePoint in Azure. And not just that, the SharePoint is coming up. You can go over to the VMs view. Okay. So in the recovery plan, E2A was our recovery plan. We can go to the protected items. We can go to the SharePoint PG, and we can see that these VMs are now all running. When we did the failover, the site was SharePoint Site 1, and they were going to Azure. Now the active location for each of these VMs is Azure. The web VMs is running in Azure, the app VM is running in Azure, and so on. And accessing these VMs is as simple as going into the virtual machines, and you can connect to those virtual machines. So if we go to the virtual machine tab and go here, press F5, that works normally in most of the cases. the VMs will load here. We are working on this 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi network, which all of you are also using. So I'm hoping it will work. Okay, let's see on this. No, this one has a different subscription. Okay, we'll maybe wait for a few seconds. Okay, cool. The SharePoint site has come up. So this is the SharePoint which we failed over from on-prem to the secondary site, and the same laptop was connecting with the on-prem and now is able to fail over to the recovery site. Okay. So we have a set of prereq. This is another important area, but since I'm running out of time and I want Philip to come on stage, I'll skip some of these infrastructure. All this is available. This is an important thing. We have also provided all the architecture details for all these things. So before you go and implement ASR, it has all the details that what are the ports you need to open. The only port which we require is HTTPS 443 outbound traffic for DR to Azure. No inbound port is opened at all, which is needed for VMM server as well as for your Hyper-V server. Now, on the on-prem to on-prem side, you will require the same HTTPS 443 for VMM to talk to ASR, but for our Hyper-V replica channel, it's a host-to-host replication channel, so you need to open port 8084 port between the two hosts. We work with ExpressRoute. There's a session. You can get more information. ASR is totally tested or certified with ExpressRoute, so if you have a lot of data to send, you can use ExpressRoute. We work with Riverbed also, so if you want to use Riverbed as appliance, you can use that also. One of the common questions we get is how can we throttle the traffic? With Riverbed and ExpressRoute, you will send a lot of traffic, but I want to throttle that replication traffic should not go beyond this particular time. So we have scripts available by which you can set up the throttling limit for either DR to Azure scenario or DR between two sites. And there is a very rich ASR FAQs. We have link available to that, which has a lot of these details, how to do the specific task for ASR. Okay, we already talked about that, and with that, let me have Philip on stage and talk about his experiences with ASR.
Thanks, Vishal. Where's the clicker? Perfect, thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Philip Moss. I work for a UK-based service provider, and we spend a lot of time building solutions, a lot of infrastructure service solutions on the Microsoft platform. Now, I had a view of DR as a service about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, and it looks something like this. DR as a service. It's a commodity product, but I might be able to do a small bolt-on to my existing user base if I'm lucky, 40% markup of my of my IaaS users. I don't say this very often, but I was. Very, very, very wrong in that view. Why? Why was I very wrong? As a service provider, I think the world should be about driving services to the cloud. And what I thought was that I was addressing this problem backwards, because I was saying, as a service provider, what I want to do is get all my users to move my services to my platform. The point is, people who are on my platform don't value DR. They're already doing cloud services. They expect their cloud platforms to be highly available. However, users who are on-prem really value DR, because they run these on-prem infrastructures that they then want to make available off-site. They want to DR things. They think DR is the best thing they've ever created. And then I realized, as a hoster, this was an enormous opportunity. Because what I could do is it allowed me to embrace the market. It allowed me to work with the on-prem community and actually bring services to market and work with them to drive the on-prem users, drive DR to me as a service provider. Now, let's think about what that offering actually looks like, how I actually go to market as a service provider. This table is here so we can look at it in detail on the slides later. Very crudely speaking, I think of DR in 4 ways. The first thing I do is I think of DR as a simple commodity similar to IaaS offering. In other words, I empower my users, my clients, to replicate. They can replicate the VMs, they can get their data either to us or to Azure, they can manage their failover plans, they can manage their DR. The price point is low, it's a low entry point solution. But then I start to think about the other options, and this is where the value proposition really comes in. Because I start talking about, well, let's build a consultancy solution around this. In option 2, I start building a fixed fee. So what we're saying to our customers is, you still look after your recovery plans, you build your DR solution, but we will explain to you how you'll do it. We'll point you in the right direction. Right? So therefore, what we're saying to our customers is, you're still in control, you're still managing to benefit, but we'll help you to understand what's going on. An option 2 approach. Then we look at an option 3 approach. We actually say, well, actually, customer, what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to look after your entire DR planning, and Vishal spoke about this, and recovery plan creation. So I'm going to figure out how to make your recovery work. I'm going to figure out how to make your applications fail over appropriately. You know, as Vishal spoke about, there are lots of applications out there that need to have their failover plans and their planning done for them. So in the option 3 slide, we're saying, we will help you with all of that. We will make sure your DR works, we will help you with DR tests. But I am not going to monitor your system when a failover has happened. When a failover occurs, you need to tell us. I am not watching your back in inverted commas. We then get to option 4, where we move into an entire managed DR scenario. And of course, in this scenario, what we're doing is we're saying we're doing everything we are in option 3. This completely managed experience where we're charging a fee to build the recovery plans, build the failover plan, but we're also going to do the monitoring. We are monitoring our on-prem clients. We are using tooling to make sure the state of their network, effectively being an outsourced network operations center, so that we are effectively underwriting their business. If there is an on-prem failure, we are guaranteeing the failover, we are guaranteeing the failover time, and we are meeting those RPO and RTO goals. So, think about this for a second. Using one core technology, ASR, the ASR you've been listening to the technical implementation all day, we are building 4 very distinct commercial offerings into the market. Each of those offerings targeted at a particular type of customer with very different price points, but all driven from that one core piece of application technology. Very, very, very powerful. Now, let's think about the way we approach the fee structure. We do it this way, others like to do it differently. So, the first thing we do is we say, right, dear customer, we are going to charge you per VM you want to replicate, flat fee. We are then going to charge you what's the best way of describing it? A template size. The reason we do this is because the VMs that get failed over are different sizes. They might be small scale IIS VMs. They might be very large SQL VMs. Right? What we effectively do is these VMs, when they're replicated, are not turned on, as Vishal has been speaking, but of course, we want to build an insurance policy into our own business model so that when those VMs are booted up, we haven't made ourselves bankrupt. So we charge a small fee dependent on the size of the VM will be when it's failed over. We then, of course, charge for the storage that we are consuming on our data center, or is being consumed in Azure. And then the last thing we do is we have a fee for the way the customer is going to connect to us in the event of failover. We've spoken about the site-to-site VPN, but also we offer remote desktop services or publishing of web app. Think about that for a second. You have customers who have, say, had an entire flood in their building. I've had customers do this. And actually, they fail over, and then you stand up remote desktop infrastructure so that they can go RDS into desktops to reach the failed over applications. In other words, we take the core ASR engine and wrap other value-add services that we already offer as part of a hoster to build compelling, valuable solutions to our customer base. Again, the core ASR offering used to drive up the value chain. Now, you then think about this packaging process, and I think there's a couple of things that's really important to point out. When we take this to market, I have to put a few safeguards in. For example, we only let our customers fail over for a certain amount of time each year. In our case, depending on their contract, it's either 20 or 28 business days a year. You might say, Philip, why do you do that? Why don't you let them fail over for longer? Well, if I let them fail over for as long as they wanted to, I've suddenly become the world's cheapest infrastructure as a service provider. Because all every single client will do is replicate to me and fail over. Now, You might say to me, but Philip, I've just lost my entire office for 3 months. That's fine. I'll let you fail over longer, but I will charge you a fee for doing it. So what we're doing here is we're saying, that's fine. We're technically going to give you a solution, but there's got to be a fee structure that makes it a commercially viable opportunity. Otherwise, I'm undercutting my own business. And the value of what we're understanding here, again, is this is not about the technology. This is all driven for ASR. This is about making this technology a commercial productization offering for the service provider community. So I have 5 minutes left, so I shall be as quick as I can. So we've spoken about how we actually engage the market, how we think about the product offering. Now we actually think about what we do in the market, how we actually go and address the market. This is enormously important. DR is not a technology offering. Disaster recovery as a service is a service and solution offering, which in our case happens to be driven by Microsoft ASR. The key value proposition is in failover plan recovery. It is in doing the planning. It is doing the monitoring. This is a services activity, not a technology activity. Now, NTTX has a key partner. They have a key partner who do a lot of taking DR to market in the form of Acuutech. Acuutech are based out of the UK. They are a service provider. They have offices in Singapore and also in Houston. They applied some quite interesting approaches to taking DR to market. The first thing they've said is, we are always going to be customer solution focused. That's really important because they go into the customers to find the correct DR needs, and then they replicate either to us, NTTX, or to Azure, depending on what is the best solution for the customer. They are not being constrained by technology. The technology is empowering them to deliver the best possible solutions to their customer. And they're doing this in 2 very interesting ways. The first thing they're doing is they're engaging their existing customer base. And actually, they have a lot of customers who are using traditional backup as a service offerings, or they're using on-prem backup. And they're actually going into them and being able to say, right, we can give you, we can give you a fully fledged DR offering, quite often at a lower cost than they're currently paying for their off-site backup solution. They get a higher value offering, often at reduced cost. The second thing they're doing, though, is that it's allowing them to engage an entire new sector. You know, they are going into larger customers where they're being able to actually drive DR solutions. Now you might think, how's a service provider, how's a solution integrator manage to go into customers who require larger DR? Well, as a solution integrator and as a service provider, Acuutech have a lot of staff who are very, very, very good at applications. They understand how to install applications. They understand how to migrate applications. That is a key skill for creating brilliant recovery plans. And what they're doing is they are leveraging their knowledge and their engineering staff skill around applications and using that combined with ASR and NTTX to drive those solutions into new market sectors and drive dedicated DR solutions into those sectors. Now, let's think about that in more detail for a second. I've summarized some of these key points. ASR is a fantastic opportunity for the service provider market. As service providers, we're always trying to make people embrace the cloud, but people are scared of doing it. ASR is the ideal light touch solution. People who are on-prem, people who have not moved to cloud, can embrace DR as a service very easily, very efficiently. It's also an enormous opportunity for service providers like NTTX and Acuutech, who are historically Microsoft-centric organizations. As ASR works well with on-prem and with physical and with VMM, it is a way for organizations like us, who traditionally have an MS-centric world, to move into those markets. And then here's the thing. Almost all DR solutions require infrastructure as a service. Vishal touched on this. You need the domain controllers, you need the DHCP, you need the DNS, you need those components running in the cloud so when failover occurs, you have that infrastructure. It's a great way to get IaaS revenue and PaaS revenue as part of a DR solution. And then finally, of course, it's what I call the upchain. You get people to move into a DR solution, often as a lower cost DR solution, and of course, in the end, they move to higher value infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or full IT outsourcing. You know, and that is an absolutely superb opportunity. Now, I want to very briefly talk about 3 very different customer type of scenarios we have running. The first one is an education establishment. Very interesting this, because they had 2 core applications that they wanted to have available for DR. They didn't have a second data center, but critically, they wanted the data center to be geographically near to them. In other words, Azure was not a suitable place to take their data. So therefore, using ASR to a service provider like NTTX was the ideal target. The second one I want to talk about, because I have only a few seconds left, is a shipping organization. They are building a complete hybrid scenario. They have on-prem infrastructure that they are building backup solutions to NTTX, but then they also have Azure-based infrastructure and other regions, including Singapore, that then is being linked together using classic hybrid scenarios with site-to-site VPNs. So that's site-to-site VPNs for their on-prem equipment into NTTX, and NTTX maintaining VPNs into Azure. All isolated, all running inside virtual networks. True hybrid cloud coupled with DR. And then the last scenario is actually a service provider. I have a client of mine who are a service provider. They didn't want to build another data center. But for compliance reasons, they needed to do replication. They replicated their entire data center infrastructure to us. Entire data center. As a classic DR failover scenario. In other words, the service provider replicates to us because Azure was not a suitable target because of data sovereignty compliance. 3 excellent solutions, all built on the core offering of ASR. Very, very, very different requirements, very different technical implications. The flexibility and capability of ASR, when mixed with a productization of of DR as a service, is a very compelling opportunity for service providers. I should now turn back to Vishal to just complete us off. I'll let you summarize.
So folks, that's all we have for today. We have a lot of related sessions available which talks about all of that, and I just want to summarize that ASR provides you a DR solution which works across all your platforms, be it VMware, Hyper-V Physical, and across all your clouds. As Philip talked about, you can use this technology for DR into service provider, to Azure or a private cloud, and works across all your workloads, SQL, SharePoint, Exchange, SAP, and so on and so forth. Thanks everyone for joining this session.